Richard Nixon was born on January 9th in 1913 in Yorba Linda, California, as the second of 5 children. While growing up to Quaker parents, who provided very little political influence, Nixon found his passion independently. Throughout his life, Nixon expressed strong qualities that allowed him to excel as a leader. In his high school career, Nixon ran as class president and showed passion for his education. He went on to graduate and continued his education at Whittier College and then proceeded to Duke University to study law. After practicing as a lawyer, Nixon served as an aviation ground officer in the Pacific for the United States Navy during World War II. After serving as a ground officer, Nixon eventually rose to the rank of lieutenant commander. In 1946, after the war had ended, Nixon would start an intense year of campaigning. He became strongly involved in Republican politics and would join an anti-war crusade. In 1950, Nixon ran against Helen Gahagan Douglas for a position in the House of Representatives and won. Because of his notable anti-communist ideals, he gained the position of vice president to Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952. During Eisenhower's campaign, Nixon was later accused of having a secret slush fund. This became a large scandal that Nixon decided to address in what became known as the Checkers speech. Nixon then used intelligent social strategies to prove his innocence, showing his strength in the political field. Once making an appearance on television, Nixon denied involvement, which restored his party's faith in his abilities. After successful campaigning, Eisenhower and Nixon were assigned to the office for the Republican Party. Due to Eisenhower's absences, Nixon had strong influence as vice president. Nixon became infamous for his tactics used in regards to restoring foreign relationships that had been previously corrupted.
Despite losses while running for president and governor, Nixon continued to practice politics, which eventually led to rerunning in 1968. During his campaigning, Nixon was recognized for his promises of ending the Vietnam War with peace and honor, as well as appealing to the silent majority. After winning the election, Nixon's first order of business was to imply and focus on the idea of Vietnamization. This involved dispatching U.S. troops from the South, which essentially closed the conflict for America. Early into his term, Nixon made it apparent that he disapproved of LBJ's previous program, the Great Society. Feeling as if the federal government had been awarded with an excess amount of power, Nixon would counter these issues by creating an act called New Federalism. This plan was established in order to redistribute power and responsibility back to the states. Nixon believed that the states should have more freedom pertaining to financial allowances, and after instating revenue sharing, the states were permitted to spend federal money more freely. Although Nixon disapproved of some of the social reform programs, such as the welfare program, he would soon instill the Family Assistance Plan. This plan provided for families who were living without a consistent form of income, giving them a strict yearly allowance. Sadly, the plan was seen as controversial and was denied by Congress. Nixon then established biracial communities to plan and implement desegregation. This program was well accepted by the states, and by the end of 1970, only 18% of African American children in the South were attending all-black schools. Other important contributions that Nixon made were the founding of the Environmental Protection Agency. This led to the passage of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Mammal Marine Protection Act. Later in his presidential career, Nixon worked to end the draft, and by 1973, the U.S. military was an all-volunteer force. During his presidency, Nixon was faced with the high inflation and unemployment rates, which would become known as stagflation. LBJ's war funding and social reform programs contributed greatly towards the inflation problem. Careless usage of deficit spending was the root of many of the nation's economic problems as well. On top of the current standing issues, the Vietnam War created many new debts that worsened the nation's previous inflation issues. The U.S. was heavily dependent on foreign oil during the difficult time. Because of wars in Egypt and surrounding areas, our connection to the vital resource was revoked and cut off. When the United States regained their connections in 1974 to the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, the prices of oil had quadrupled. This would also contribute to the growing inflation problems that had been plaguing the nation. In order to combat the issue, Nixon formulated various proposals. One of these proposals was to raise taxes and create new budget cuts, but in response, Congress denied the idea. Another suggested solution that was put into place was the raising of interest rates. Unfortunately, this was only seen as a temporary fix since the changes in rates would eventually lead to a mild recession. During 1970, in a final attempt to resolve the issue of inflation, the president was given power by Congress to impose wage cuts and freeze prices. The act of freezing prices lasted for the duration of 90 days and was the eventual fix to inflation, despite the fact that it worsened the recession.
After being elected in November of 1968, Nixon appointed Henry Kissinger as his advisor on foreign affairs. Henry Kissinger promoted the idea of realpolitik. In the promotion of realpolitik, he expressed that foreign policy should be based on the power of an area instead of morals and principles. Kissinger worked with Nixon to achieve foreign policies that were beneficial towards the country. He pulled the nation away from confrontational confinement that ignored communist countries and forced the United States to face world powers. Kissinger also enforced a tie-in which was made to ease Cold War tensions. In May of 1972, Nixon visited the Soviet Union. There he participated in the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, with Soviet Secretary General Brezhnev as part of an effort to temper the Cold War through diplomatic deterrent. Nixon also signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile, or ABM, treaty to help calm the United States and the Soviet Union tensions by composing the threat of nuclear weapons. Along with the help of Henry Kissinger, Nixon reduced the United States' presence in the Vietnam War. He de-escalated United States involvement and oversaw negotiation with North Vietnam in order to resolve ties. President Nixon also established a foreign policy doctrine in 1969 which called for the United States to act within its natural interests and keep all existing treaty commitments with its allies. During Nixon's presidency, he also created new relationships with the Middle East that eliminated Soviet dominance in the region and worked towards regional peace. In the Middle East, Nixon initiated Project Independence in the reaction to the oil embargo of 1973. This would set a timetable to end reliance on foreign oil by 1980.
One of the lasting impressions Nixon received while president was a controversial event, the Watergate scandal. The Watergate scandal was initially started by the wiretapping of office phones and the photographing of top-secret documents at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Once the scandal was released, Nixon had trouble formulating a response towards the career-ending issue. FBI investigations were stopped, and the White House continued to deny any involvement. News revealed that the White House had possession of presidential conversations on whether or not Nixon had knowledge of the incident. After a year, the tapes were finally obtained but consisted of 1,254 pages of edited information. However, evidence still continued to be released, proving Nixon as a participant in the scandal, and would soon lead to the impeachment process. Before action would take place, Nixon would announce his resignation, leaving the scandal unresolved. Overall, Nixon was known for imposing new strategies and ideas that strayed from previously established norms. He was strict and harsh in his handling of domestic affairs and was viewed as notorious for his management of foreign affairs. One of his most successful ideas was formed in his partnership with Kissinger when the two decided to look past the morals of an area that the U.S. would have potential in seeking a partnership with. Under Nixon's influence, the United States was able to restore peaceful relations with many areas that had been previously destroyed.